All right, punks. So, is there something wrong? Is there something rotten? Is there a power behind the throne? We, Dr. Blaxill and Simon D6 Wounds, are going to be talking about what's wrong with Old World and what we can do to fix it. So, before we launch into our discussion, I should say something about my esteemed guest. Simon D6 Wounds has an excellent YouTube channel with numerous battle reports in a similar style to Dr. Blaxill. In fact, Dr. Blaxill actually copied him originally. It also features numerous exposés of things like the drilled rule, line of sight, and the charge, with forensic detail. So, I suggest you go ahead. If you haven't already hit the Dr. Blaxill subscribe button, obviously you should do that now. But after you've done that, you should go over to D6 Wounds and hit his. So, I suppose I should begin matters by asking you, D6 Wounds, how you've managed the transition from 8th edition to Old World.
Good evening, Dr. Blaxill. Yeah, transition. Although I'm still playing a bit of 8th edition, as you've noticed recently. We went to that tournament not so long ago in Cardiff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely a transition, isn't it? Yeah, I'm enjoying Old World though. I mean, it's a different game. It feels different. There's a lot more people there. But I suppose if I was to summarize it, it kind of feels more. It feels more skirmish, doesn't it? It feels more light. It feels more like Hero Hammer. And I suppose coming from 8th edition, it's a big change.
Yeah, it also feels, I think, as though, because you're playing 2,000 points, there are less models on the table. It does feel a bit more skirmishy. I mean, there's a modesty. That's a little bit more like, I guess, what 4th and 5th edition were like. There were less models on the table there. So it does feel more, you know, I mean, the games sometimes still take quite a long time, but it does feel a bit more kind of abbreviated. But playing both at the same time, as we're both doing, though, is a bit of a challenge. I mean, I was playing at this 8th ed event that D6 Wounds is talking about in Cardiff, and at one point, and my opponent, to his credit, stopped me. I tried to charge my paladin mounted on a Pegasus backwards.
Oh.
The ultimate moment would be you're playing 8th and he just lets you charge it backwards and says, okay.
Yeah, go for it.
I did make that mistake. The other mistake I made as well when playing 8th was there was a bit where I was fighting a Chaos Dwarf special character on a Bale Taurus, and I forgot that mounts and riders have different profiles in 8th ed, and so I threw my Lord's attacks into the rider, and he was harder to hit. And then only later did I remember, oh yeah, I should attack the monster, and then I just killed him with the heroic killing blow. So these things happen when you go back after you've been playing a lot of Old World.
Yeah. But it's interesting that they've deliberately gone back to 50% characters allowance, isn't it? Because obviously 8th, they went up to 50 for the end times, and then the community brought it back down to 25% again.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, there was 25% lords and heroes, so it was 50% characters in a way, but there was that lords and heroes distinction, and the lords were obviously where the real power lied mostly. With Old World, there's no distinction. It's just 50-50. So it's like it was. There used to be 50% character allowance in 4th ed and 5th ed. I think the difference there, though, was that the characters were more expensive than they are now. So it feels as though you can have a really Rolls-Royce Lord and a really Rolls-Royce Lizard, it might be a Lizard, Wizard, and a bit to spare with Old World, that you don't really have to make that choice. Whereas in 6th ed, one thing that sometimes people liked about that was that if you had 2,000 points, you could have one Lord level character, and that could either be a combat Lord or a Wizard Lord. And so you sort of had to make that choice. Only if you played 3,000 points could you have both of those things.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, so there were kind of differences, but yeah, the transition thing, man, it's just innate with it. I mean, I'm playing what 9th age, 8th edition, Old World, and a bit of 6th edition as well, and you know this is bound to cause all sorts of confusion.
But it's not holding you back, is it? I see you're speaking from the streets there with a bit of graffiti.
Yes, exactly. I'm speaking from the streets. Precisely. And this, punks, absolutely. There's been a lot of graffiti appearing down, these parts. And what have they been saying? They've been saying that Dr. Blaxill was right. It was even
Well, I saw your
worse.
video about the the LGT.
Yeah.
Congrats on your win.
Yeah. Oh my word. That's something
You
very
got the
strange
trophy
happening
there. There
now,
you
and you
go.
can see it amongst obviously these streets are real. There's no trick
Yeah, yeah.
photography here, but there we go.
And it's kind of it's been that event in particular was kind of built up a bit in the competitive online world.
Exactly.
And it turned out to be a bit of a cheese fest. Is that fair to say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was a complete cheese fest, but I think it was a cheese fest in a more ruthless, unpleasant way than I've ever seen before for the following reasons. Now, first of all, there are only 48 players at this tournament. So I think that the amount of attention it was getting online was not justified. Was it a higher quality than Triple Crown that we went to, which had probably a few more players than that? Not really. I don't think so. But for some reason, because it was ponied up with a massive 40K event where there were 800 players in the 40K event, 800, my word, in this huge athletics centre in North London, Lee Valley, alongside, I guess, an Age of Sigmar event, not with 800, but with probably more than 48. I guess it got quite a lot of publicity.
Yeah.
But was it Cheese Fest? The way in which it was cheesy, I think, was that there were loads of unpainted or 3D printed armies there.
Sure.
All the Bretonians, I think this is correct to say, all of the Bretonians were all 3D printed contrast paint ones, I think.
Okay.
Apologies there if I'm describing an army to one of those who wasn't, but from what I could tell, they were.
Well, a lot of people won't take that as an insult, though.
No, that's true. They think, oh, that's fine.
Yeah.
Like the High Elf double dragon list that I fought. Very nice guy who commanded it, but as I say, the double wingless dragon and 2 frost hearts reduced to metal sticks, one of which was never even taken out of the box. It began as a stick and ended as a stick. These were the sort of lists that you saw there were, most of them were not ones for, shall we say, the painting connoisseur. Let's put it like that. And I think a lot of those lists, like the guy who came second in the event, was like a massive, very decorated 40K champion, for example. And so I think there was a lot of 40K interpolation there. Triple Crown was mainly 8th ed players and a few 6th, I think, playing Old World, whereas the London GT was, I think, Age of Sigmar and 40K players primarily playing Warhammer the Old World. And I think that creates...
Did it feel like you...
Yeah.
Did it feel like you were at a side event, or did it feel like
100%? Yes. So we were the main kind of auditorium or main body of it, where there was this big running track and that had all the tables. That was all 40K for as far as the eye could see. And there was one little sort of annex bit. I think it was on a basketball court or something on one side, and that was where the Old World stuff was happening. So, oh yeah, you definitely felt that it was a sideshow without any question. But that's the nature of the beast.
Actually, I kind of like the fact though that Old World isn't a kind of flagship Games Workshop product, right? Because it kind of saves us from all of the sort of constant rules updates and points changes, and the state of 40K at the moment isn't really something. I'm glad Old World isn't going through that.
100%. I think that's right. I mean, it is more localized, and I do think it's much more dependent. I think local metas matter more. I think local groups of gamers matter more, and there isn't this almost esport like professionalization you see, I think, with 40K, where there is this real obsession with, maybe not be balance exactly, but that there is this obsession with meta hammering. And, this is a point we'll talk about later, literally just riding the meta, printing your list, painting it, probably with contrast paint, and just rocking up with this thing. I mean, that it's very far removed from Stillmania. And I still think that the fact that, as you say, Old World is quite localized and feels a little bit provincial, I think does, in a sense, keep a lid on that a little bit. So it's probably not necessarily a bad thing that it's not super big.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting you say that, because a few points came out of your video, and maybe I'm going to play the devil's advocate for a little.
Oh, please do. You're the one trespassing on my streets from out there in space.
Beaming down. So, I mean, a critic of your video might say that perhaps you're contradicting yourself a little bit, right? Because on the one hand, you've made this point about, it's not so much about what list beats what, and designing the ultimate list. It's more about the decisions you make on the tabletop, right? And you made the point about, it's not that Brett's are overpowered. You didn't win because you had the Green Knight or whatever, right? It's the decisions that you make in the game. But on the other hand, we kind of said, well, your games, the meta is quite flat, and the Bretonnian armies were all quite similar, right? So Bretonnia came first, second, and third,
and fourth.
Yeah. Then maybe Bretonnia is overpowered. Maybe it is about the list that you bring. You know what I mean?
Well, I suppose, in a sense, you can have both, in the sense that, if everyone is bringing a meta-y list and the meta is quite flat, then you could have a tournament where all 20 players were Bretonians or Bo Shabti, Tomb King Grindfest, or Fanatics or something. There were 5 different armies. And then within that, then you have generalship mattering. I think that's more what I kind of mean. When I say the meta is very flat, I just mean that all the armies are very similar. So long as you've got one of those similar armies, then I think your generalship does matter quite a lot. But I think the kind of ways you command the army are not as interesting as I would like. And they don't seem like, it's a bit like, I suppose, though there are like 3 buttons on a control pad or something instead of 20. I mean, it feels as though there are, and it still requires skill and stuff, and you still got to do that in the right order and all the rest of it. It just feels a lot more simplistic, I think, than 8th edition did, or the version of 8th that we've played, which is kind of admittedly quite heavily fan patched, where all of the armies could feel competitive in their own contexts. And that's where, when I say I feel there was a lot more interaction between the different kind of lists and things. Whereas here, I feel as though you've got to have I think there are about 5 different ones, it seems. And if you've got one of them, then you've got a certain number of options, up, down, left, and right, and a couple of fire buttons. And as it's fine, it's just not particularly varied compared to what I'm comparing it to, which is not a fair comparison.
Well, hence the pertinence of this discussion, right? Because if everyone's already found what the optimal lists are for each faction, then perhaps it needs a bit, to use your words, fan patching, to open up new list builds and add more variety.
Absolutely. Now, the great comparison here, dear viewers, of course, that we're relying on is, of course, 8th edition. And that's because that's what both myself and D6 Wounds know a lot about. And there are more older historic comparisons that could be compared against. But in 8th edition, there was, of course, this very extensive fan patching. But I rather wonder with that whether that was needed to make the game as good as it could be. You see, 8th Ed out of the box, and this is where I think a lot of the criticism of 8th Ed sometimes came in, and some people who played it for 6 months or a year and then just said, oh, this is all about Death Stars, and the way of beating a Death Star is Dwellers and Purple Sun and a 6/6. I don't like this game, which I think is the opinion that I sometimes see. I'm caricaturing it, I'm sure, sometimes given quite a lot by some people who dropped out with early 8th. Their view, whether this is right or not, I don't know, at that time would probably have been, 8th Ed does need a lot of patching because it is a quite flat meta itself. I'm not sure I'm not sure I would have agreed with that at the time. Let's put it like that. I think 8th Ed 1 year in was a lot better than Old World 1 year in. But nonetheless, it still needed something quite clearly and became much better as a result of the patching.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the balance between the factions was unbalanced between the factions, right?
Yes.
And so it needs a comp system, but otherwise you're just going to have a few factions sort of running away with every event. Whereas in Old World, the balance between the factions isn't that bad.
Yeah.
But there's kind of there's some flaws in the core rules, aren't there? Which makes the balance between the troop types off, and it makes it clunky, and it's a different type of problem, isn't it?
Yes.
We'll talk about that, obviously.
Yeah, I think with what happened with, as you say, with 8th was the problem. The reason why a comp system was really needed was to bring the full variety of troops, I think, to bear. Because there were some, troops, like thinking about from the Chaos book, for example, in 8th Ed, you would never choose a Slaughter Brute. It's rubbish if you were being competitive. You would never pick Ogres instead of Chaos Trolls. You would never pick Dragon Ogres because there were other options that were so much better than they were. But if you put a comp system in and you gave like some troops negative points or plus points, then suddenly all of the options became sort of had some utility on the tabletop again, and so you felt as though every troop in the book could be worth something. So I think so it's about different factions themselves and also troop types within factions. What there wasn't in in Eighth Ed was something like there is in Old World with, like, for example, a whole genre of troops, infantry in this case, which is the worst of the lot because infantry are the most important of them all, feeling as though they're kind of redundant. I don't think there was ever that. Maybe non-flying monsters in Eighth Ed, sort of, and heavy cavalry, sort of. And even now, then I think there are quite a few exceptions to that.
Yeah,
Patch day.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's got flaws in the core rules, which there wasn't really much wrong with the core rules. It's just
I think we should talk a little about that. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, this is an appreciated viewers. This won't be something, a view that you kind of will share. I think we both think that there are some issues with the core rules that feel a bit weird. And so when we're talking about fixing Old World, these are some of the things I guess we think are kind of broken about it. I mean, one of them you mentioned there was infantry and their general feeling of redundance, especially outside tar pit options.
Well, just to take a step back there, I mean, the discourse online has been overwhelmingly positive for pretty much since its release. And I think you and I, and maybe a few other lone voices, were being critical of it. And it was almost like this overwhelming positivity. And I think that's started to crack now. And you can see a lot of people sort of openly sort of saying, look, there are obvious issues, aren't there? And so I don't think it's that controversial anymore to sort of say, look, we need to kind of, as a community, or, obviously if Games Workshop takes the lead, then great. But to try and fix, in inverted commas, what those issues are. I mean, personally, if I were to summarize all of the problems, which obviously we can go through them one by one, but like if I was to kind of summarize my feel of what's wrong, it would be that when you play the game competitively, it doesn't look like it does in the pictures. So, if you look at the Old World rulebook, or you look at Forces of Fantasy, Ravening Hordes, they've got pictures there. And obviously, a lot of those pictures are primarily just to show off the models, but they do have pictures of battles as well.
Yes.
And people might be playing it like that, just like it looks in the pictures with their friends at home. But when you play it competitively, it just doesn't look like that. You don't have ranked up units of infantry, with the exception of maybe skeletons or night goblins. You don't have sort of lots of units in a line and battle lines and things. It's just a mess of, like, why take a block of Chaos Warriors when you can take a single Dragon Ogre Shartak on his own, and it just...
I think it's a really powerful point. Exactly. And I think this almost goes beyond specific complaints there. That's a very, very visionary point, I think, in that there was an idea about what this game should look like. And that game, it's not just from current Old World publications, it's from a whole montage of feelings of what Warhammer should look like on the table. And there is a variety between editions. Of course, in 8th Ed, maybe you've got a big unit there to a greater extent than in older ones. But in their own publications, it's very like that. You see a balance of stuff. You see your ranked up units and things. In Old World, there are sometimes characters outside of units, which can look kind of nice in a way, because, you get a bit more focus on them. But competitive, as you say, it just doesn't look like that at all in most cases. I mean, there are some hideous pictures that I've seen of, as I say, lines being won, loads of single models. People sometimes don't even feel they need to turn the models the right way around a lot of the time, because why would you? Because it can see everywhere. So you're going to get the back side of my Pegasus shoved in your face every time. And there are others as well. Because of this, somehow there's, as you say, a feel and aesthetic to what the game looks like, which makes it different from a skirmish game, which is the unique thing.
Yeah.
This kind of Warhammer, as I say, it's a game that's fought on square bases and in square-shaped formations and with arcs of sight. When you start hitting that or chipping that away, it ceases to look like what we think it should.
I mean, it's always the same thing. There's always that you figure out. Games Workshop has obviously identified quite correctly some of the things that were wrong or disliked from the previous edition, but then they correct it in such a way that's so extreme. It's like the pendulum swings the other way, sort of thing. And I mean, they've added different dynamics to the movement. For example, like you've got countercharge and evade and reserve move and all this stuff, which is great. But then they go too far and add skirmishers with 360 charge arcs, and it's like you've gone too far. Like,
yeah,
rules are great, but then you've gone too far.
You're dead right about that, Simon. The swing, the pendulum swing. Yeah. Well, look, they did it in 6th. They said, we don't like hero hammer, so we're going to stop you taking many heroes. You can't have a big wizard and a big lord. You can only have one. I mean, that was that. If you liked hero hammer, you're not going to like that. And then in an 8th, they said, oh, well, infantry aren't good enough in 7th edition. So now we're going to really make infantry good. And now all this time later, there's this wrong perception, in my opinion, that 8th killed fantasy because of its big hordes and its nasty number 6 spells and all of this. Yeah. So therefore, let's go to 2d6 magic and make infantry garbage and go back to heroes. So there is definitely a feeling of correction and overcorrection, unfortunately. I wonder why they do. I don't wonder why they can't quite make it right, or maybe it's up to the fans to pull them back from their oversteer.
It is crazy, isn't it? It's oversteer, and then obviously the big one, of course, is that you didn't see characters riding dragons because they could be cannoned off easily, but now they add the characters and the dragon adds their wounds together. They can have 3 saving throws, yes. And at the same time, cannons are only AP2 and D3 wounds. Well, then it's too much. Like, now dragons are invincible,
Yeah, exactly. There was, as you say, a crude Darwinian kind of thing. And okay, so the gun, in 8th Ed, the gun was probably a bit better than the monster for the most part. That's probably true. And now, as you say, the gun has been nerfed to oblivion. And the monster is miles better. And to think that, maybe that's not going to have some kind of an effect. I mean, or at least not. Why? I mean, very crudely, I don't know how difficult it would be to sort of test the theory of, well, you've got the dragon and he's facing 2 cannons. What sort of damage is he going to take if he charges in turn 3 from these cannons compared to what he used to?
Yeah, exactly.
And instead of being dead like twice over, which he might have been in the past, now he's probably taken 3 wounds or something, if that.
Yeah. Well, not even that. If he's got a 2 up, 5 up, 5 up, he's laughing, isn't he? Yeah,
probably. So it does seem. I don't know. I mean, it comes back to this whole thing of, this is all speculative. But I mean, when they designed the game, what were they? I mean, what were they? They had a lot of good ideas and they had some good stuff to build on. But what were they on when they did this? I mean, I just feel that even in the UK alone, if they'd have involved some of the 9th Age players, for example, who are these real rules experts in the game, and at best, I won this tournament and I'm at best an average 9th Age player, no better than that. And there are these real philosopher kings, and they are not playing Old World, I hasten to add. So that's why, you might think a lot of people who are real champs now are the best games players. Oh no, they're not, or oh no, we're not. Yeah. I know many people. I played people at this game who were so good that I couldn't get near them. That if they gave me a 6/6 charge, I'd take it because that was the best chance I thought I'd get. And there are some players that are that good. And I'm sure if any of these had been involved in this game for even an elementary amount of time, they would not have put some of these problems into the game.
Yeah.
But they weren't there.
We've got to, I mean, when people talk about how are they going to fix the game, right? It kind of descends into a sort of wish list of, this would be nice if this would change, this would be nice if this would change. And in reality, until we get a new edition of the game, we're not going to change some of the core problems around, infantry not pulling their weight, or dragons being too hard to kill. I mean, there might be slight changes that you could do to maybe tinker on the edges, and a TO might be able to house rule something here and there. But I think trying to do a grand fix will just end up having too many knock-on effects.
Yes.
To, either hurt some factions more than others, or just unbalance the game in another way,
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are things they could add, for example, like mission-based play, which might help a bit. But in terms of the actual core rule problems, I agree. It's the whole whack-a-mole phenomenon, unfortunately. I mean, if you go and you change one thing, it has an effect on another. I mean, they can do little changes on the side, like this weird thing they have with skirmishers, for example, whereas if you don't get into the sort of second rank, you just kind of die on a skirmishing charge. That means that you have to be a bit more careful with the charges you do with your peg knights, for example. But that's a very strange way of making skirmishers a bit worse. And there are a few things a bit like that. But, but some of the fundamentals of, you could talk about 360 degrees, you could talk about hero hammer, line hammer, the stuff with impetuous troops, mandatory overruns, God, fall back in good order abuse, when you fall back and you bounce over things, and then you reform in a great formation, and then you just go and say, hey, I'm going to charge. Those feel like core problems with the game that I don't see how they could change. I mean, for example, here's maybe one could discuss, like the pursuit move. Now, in 8th edition, I just catch you if I get the same or more than you on the dice, and you're caught and you're killed on the spot, and then we resolve how I move. In Old World, it's the other way around. We resolve how I move first, and then determine whether I've hit you, and then I kill you. And the pursuing units all move in the order that you decide to move them in, so they can block each other. You have a unit spinning around before it starts fleeing or pursuing, which can give it like a sort of an advantage. And it's just really imprecise. And arguments are created on whether you've just like managed to catch that dragon with your pursuing gyrocopter or not, which could decide the entire game, quite frankly. And they could just put out an FAQ and just say, all it is now is pursuit has been abstracted. If you get equal to or more than, depending on what you prefer, the pursuing enemy, you just kill them on the spot, and then you move your troops without any of the pressure of deciding whether you've actually caught them or not. And that would be such an elegant, easy fix. It wouldn't upset anybody, but it would mean they'd have to errata their game.
Yeah, and as far as I understand as well, because when you fall back in good order, you bounce through your own troops, but when you're pursuing, you don't pursue through your own troops. And
so the enemy bounce through both your troops and their troops, but you don't unless you fly. So
the pursuers end up just getting stuck on their own models, whatever.
They get stuck, and that's why fall back in good order is so perverse, because of course at the end of that you can reform, face any direction, and then charge in your next turn. So you can get some great situations out of that with very janky fallbacks.
Yeah, and they could at least say, if you get a give ground, you can choose to fall back.
Yeah,
fullback is often better than give ground.
Great idea. I completely agree with that. Very often you don't want to give ground because you get locked. You want fullbacks. Personally, I wouldn't let troops that have fallen back in good order charge at all, actually. But that's more of a stylistic thing. I mind the fallback thing a little bit less, because at least I can appreciate that fallback in good order was a stylistic change they made in Old World. And, a lot of people really like fallbacks. They think it simulates fluid warfare in a really cool way. And there are some problems with it that they need to kind of fix. That's a stylistic change, and they're working around it. But some of the things, we both complained about this, and there's an excellent video on D6 Wounds channel about this, the charge move, where, because you have to pay for your wheel out of charging, first of all, that's very hard to measure. And also you can end up with some silly instances where you end up with a very kind of corner clip charge, which look bizarre on the table and can give some sides, like one side, a really big advantage.
And it's another nerf for infantry, basically. Infantry are already really bad. And they're bad in so many different ways, though. It's not just one issue, is it? It's bad because they disincentivize ranks and they incentivize files. They don't have step up. They can't. The second rank can't fight. The charge distances between swift stride and not swift stride are more. There's a difference between them. And this pay for the wheel on the charge,
which hurts infantry more because they're bigger units.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and so the infantry issue to me is the one which kind of everybody agrees needs to be fixed.
Everyone agrees with that. I agree. Yeah.
Everybody wants infantry in the game. And, we were talking about missions, and we'll talk about them in detail a bit later, but even with missions, right, and objectives and things, okay, that might bring in some of the basic core troops to just sit on objectives, but it still doesn't solve the issue of having the elite infantry. And, when you see a high elf army, you want to see some spearmen and some white lions and some sword masters and some Phoenix Guard and, to make it a cool army.
You would just have the basic infantry, I think, because it would be the cheapest and it would still score. Yeah, I mean, and this I think is also a problem with what some people say, I'll just give the infantry more static combat res. You see, this is again for this very, I think it's a bit of a sick-fed mentality. Sorry, sick-fed people, that there's this idea that, well, infantry primarily should be there for static combat resolution. And that makes absolute sense when you're talking about a tar pit. But with elite infantry, that's not really how they should behave. I mean, sure, you can give them a bit of extra for a rank, but a rank of extra swordmasters or Phoenix Guard is a lot more difficult to have than a rank of spearmen. So you need to make elite infantry and basic infantry feel different. I don't think basic infantry are kind of, I guess, okay in Old World, right? Because they have a huge, very large number. So they get fall back in good order as an option for a long time. And they get, as good a static combat res as infantry get. They can't charge and they can't fight, but then neither can the elite infantry either. So comparatively, they're better in just a very negative way, but not satisfying.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're going to annoy different groups of people, depending on how you try and fix the game, right? And, if you bring back Step Up, for example, that's going to annoy the 6th edition crowd because it's like you're going back to 8th edition, which they didn't like, and so you've got to, ideally you want to maintain the feeling of Old World, which is why I wouldn't want to touch things like the whole fighting rank can fight, and then you don't have Step Up. I'd want to maintain that, but also try and give infantry a buff in some way that would maintain the feel of Old World and wouldn't feel like you're going back to another edition.
Yeah, I think that is quite important, actually, in its way, isn't it? Because one has to respect that they have made certain stylistic calls, and it is this version of Warhammer, and just simply resurrecting an old edition, even though we've all got our preferences, it doesn't seem to respect that. And I mean, I don't agree with some of the changes that they've made, sort of kind of on a fundamental basis, but I don't think they're unworkable. I just don't like them stylistically. But in a sense, kind of who cares? We've all got music styles that we like the most, or styles of art or something that we like the most, but we still, wouldn't want every other style of music to all change to the one we wanted. There has to be that diversity. And so I agree with you that I wouldn't change the rules about the fighting rank, for example, because that's one of the stylistic changes they've decided to make. So it might be that some of these core rules changes probably only happen in a new edition of Old World. I mean, magic is another one as well, really. I mean, that's not so much because the magic doesn't work, because I don't think the magic is broken. I think the 2d6 system is, with its auras of dispel and stuff, I think it works okay. I think it's boring, but I think it works.
Yeah.
I don't think there's something functionally dreadful about it. Everyone casts the spell almost all the time, and everyone dispels the spell all the time. They don't think about it, and you can just get on with the game. If you want magic to be that kind of automatic thing that just sort of happens in the background, and you like that style of the game, then Old World magic's probably quite nice for you. I don't. I like grand magic. I like I like the idea of the game stopping and magic happening to feel meaningful. But again, that's stylistic more than it is anything else. And so, in a sense, at least with magic, they made that change, but at least the system works. So I'm less critical about
magic. Yeah. The complaint about magic is normally that people duplicate the same spell multiple times, right? And that's what makes it boring, because if someone's got 5 pillars of fire on the board and just moving these templates through you, then it's like, well, I mean, obviously there's an easy fix to that, right? You just say you can't take the same spell twice, like it isn't like it was in 8th edition, with the exception of the signature spells.
With the exception of signatures, exactly.
Yeah. So if you had 2 level 4s on battle magic, one level 4 would have 3 spells and the signature, the other level 4 would have the other 3 spells and the signature.
Yeah, you'd get some spam because some signatures, like the demonology signature, could be spammed, but that would eliminate most of the spamming issue. I think that the issue with magic is, I mean, first of all, I think certainly the 2d6 casting and 2d6 stopping, the glorified coin toss, is just inherently boring. And also the other problem is the spells, man, because I think because every spell is 2d6 and it has a casting value of between 6 and 10, there's a certain degree to which the power of the spells needs to, I think, almost be fairly similar. And so a lot of the magic missiles are just 2d6 strength 4 hits, basically, or some variation of it. And all of the vortexes do a similar amount of damage. The difference with Pillar of Fire is that you can move it, which makes it automatically better. And just most of these spells just do similar things. And you think about the level of diversity of magic that there was in 8th edition, or the diversity of magic that there was in 4th ed, 5th ed. The spells just did a lot more different things on the table, I think, than they do in Old World. I think there are only a small number of different effects. There are occasional ones like the Phantasmagoria dark magic spell, which I don't like particularly, but at least it does something a bit different to the other spells in terms of its effect. Yeah. Whereas many of the others, as I say, they all just feel quite boilerplate and quite similar. And so then when you get spammed ones, it feels like the logical extension of that. Multiple Pillars of Fire, or you load up, with as many fireballs, or Blue Fire of Tzeentch, for example, Chaos Signature, and you just bang, 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 bang that. And so I've played a list with 6 magic missiles in it, and they're all similar range. The only difference is some of them have got range 24 instead of 18, and some of them are AP2, and some of them are AP1, and some of them are AP0. They're all strength 4, and you're just 2d6ing all the time, and that's it. And your opponent is 2d6ing all the time to dispel it because he doesn't want it, and it's as simple as that, really. And that's not very interesting. But at least I don't think that shows the system is broken, though. I think it just shows there's just nowhere near enough variety in it.
So would you, if you were running a tournament for Old World, would you errata some rules? Would you add in some house rules to try and fix some of these things, or would you just not want to tinker with it?
I think that, so I have run an Old World event. I did this with the Cardiff Crusade people.
Yeah, I was there, yeah.
Right at the beginning. Yeah, of course, you were there, of course, Simon. And with that, we did make a couple of changes to the core rules, but the main thing we did was putting in missions. And these missions are found in the 9th Age. They're found in Kings of War. And you get 20 points for a round in competitive play. And if you don't have missions, it just depends on how many points you've kind of defeated your opponent by to see how many of those 20 points you carry home. If it's a draw, it's 10 each. And the missions were a 6-point swing in that. And in order to do the missions, you had to capture terrain pieces, hold the center of the board, invade the enemy deployment zone, and various other things. And the only things that could do that were scoring units, and scoring units were ones with banners. And obviously that means dragons and heroes and monsters don't score. And that, I think that improved the game quite a lot. So that would be the biggest thing I would change. I would probably also, if I was doing it again, probably make a few changes, like with the magic missile spam. But the core problem, though, with that, though, as you said before, Simon, is the moment you make a change like that, one faction loses a lot by that. So the Wood Elves get hurt by me saying that, because one of their best things is loads of sisters all casting Pillar of Fire. Cool. And other factions don't get hurt. So, or if you go and whack 360-degree characters, say, then Bretonnians lose the most from that because they're the most reliant on them. Or you limit, well, they did actually limit fanatics, actually. They did make that change. And that's, that obviously only hurts one faction. So I feel that if you're going to do that, make those sorts of changes to the actual factions, I think you've got to do them all to all of the factions simultaneously. And I think that that's the core problem. We were going to talk about factions on this video, and who's best and who's not. That if you can't just go and ban the Green Knight. Sorry, guys, you can't go and do that on its own. If you're going to do something like that or make him worse or something, you need to change the other things as well, because they're all part of an ecosystem. And if you nerf the pest controllers, then the dragon controllers, let's call them that, the dragons are gonna be better. So you've got to do everything.
I mean, I could make the case now for lots of different rules changes that I would do, and maybe if we've got time, we can do that. But like you say, you've got to do it in a way. You've got to think about it, and not just react to one faction's doing well, so let's hit it on the head. And I've actually seen, I mean, the tournament packs that I've seen at the moment,
Yeah.
there hasn't actually been nerfs to Bretonia, have there?
No.
There's been nerfs. I've seen a couple with nerfs to Orc Boar Boys, which I don't think is called for, which we can go through.
What's the nerf to them out of interest?
Well, I've seen ones. Well, there's one that Scott's running where the Biggins rule doesn't apply to the boar, right? Which
Yes, of course, because there's this model versus
yeah, which is what it was in 8th edition. But I don't think it's not really an FAQ. It's not something that's unclear that needs.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's an FAQ, right? If something's unclear, you've got some people who play it one way, and you've got other people who play it another way. And so if those two people were to meet in a tournament, there might be an argument, right? So it's the TO's job to say, look, let's have an FAQ for this event. This is how we're going to play it, right? But the Biggins rule, it's not really unclear. It's just an errata, right? It's just that's been put in the pack to nerf Boar Boys, right? I think it's, if you look at the other rules in the book, like the Chopper's rule, it says very clearly only applies to the Orc and not the Mount. The Tusker Charge rule, it says very clearly this applies to the Mount and not the Orc. And so the Biggin rule applies to both. And I don't think that's, in my opinion, I don't think it's an FAQ. I think it's an errata. So in other words, it's a nerf, right? And I've seen other packs where they've got a nerf to dwarfs, which is limiting infantry units to 10 wide, which effectively is a nerf to dwarfs. I mean,
operationally, yes.
Yeah, you can call it what you want, but it's dwarfs that need or want to put their units in lines, right? And I find it quite funny that, you know, you can have double dragon elf list, you can have a 360 charging Brett list, you can have a multi-screen vampire list, but 11 dwarfs in a line? No.
Yeah, I'm guilty of this in a way, because, I was the guy who was, bitching about Linehammer at the beginning. But the thing with that is that I was complaining about Linehammer because it was perverse. In absolute terms and relative to ranked up infantry. But again, Old World is probably more balanced with Linehammer in than Linehammer out. Exactly. And that's the peculiar thing, because some factions need lines, and the lines in any case, are a buff to infantry. And as you say, operationally limiting Linehammer hurts dwarves because they need Linehammer more than anyone else.
Well, exactly, because dwarves only have infantry and war machines. They don't have cavalry, they don't have chariots or monsters or anything like that. They've just got infantry, and so the only way to give infantry lots of attacks is to go wide, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think with that, and also the point about the Boar Boys, the interesting thing with those two nerfs are they weren't put in with the intention of nerfing a faction. I don't think.
No, I agree.
They probably, it's just an unintended consequence.
Yeah,
but that can have quite a big effect. I mean, the Boar Boy rule, which sounds quite, probably to listeners might sound quite minor. If you're rocking, I don't know how many Boar Boys you're currently taking in your list, Simon. It's a beautiful third ed regiment of things. It's beautiful looking center to the army. That has a major effect upon the viability of that and obviously nomadic war in general.
Yeah.
So I think this is where lobbying kind of comes in a bit, I think. And I mean, if you, with the unintended consequences, maybe that just happens. But if there's a concerted attempt to nerf a particular thing or nerf a particular faction, I think it can feel a bit as though like those who are getting in more positions of political influence can get their enemies' armies nerfed and their armies don't get nerfed.
Yeah. I mean, if we put it to a vote, right? Do you think the Green Knight should be able to charge when the turn he appears? That's getting nerfed today.
It will be nerfed today. Yeah, undoubtedly. Only most Bretonians probably would vote against it, but probably some would still probably vote for it, and almost everyone else would vote that it should have. It should be nerfed. But I mean, this is not unique to Old World, I don't think. I think with 8th, when comp systems started being introduced, and we talk a bit more about comp systems later, I think it's probably true that, certain factions were favored by them more, but because you had such powerful, I'm talking way back when 8th was still live, like you had the South Coast GT or Games Workshop's own events, they probably were in a sense, benign, well, not benign dictators. They were still vulnerable to lobbying in their own way, I guess, but they sort of set those rules. Whereas now with Old World, you've got lots of these really small events who, in a sense, are all making their own rules up. And so a lot of who wins an event might come down to some of these minor changes. Like there was some attention of this Nova Open, which I think the Squarehammer YouTube channel did. And that had, I think, 2,500 points and 35% characters or something. It had some of their own little tweaks in it. But a lot, obviously, of what factions were good there, Brett's, because they made dragons only have 7 wounds there and they didn't do anything to the other guys, did really well because of the way they'd changed the core mechanics. At the London GT, well, they let the Green Knight come out of hills, so that helped him, obviously. So sometimes there will be what factions do well might be the artifact of the changes the tournament organizers have made, which is, of course, another reason why just talking about meta lists is probably not a good idea, because, you know, if you're playing in my house, I've got these rules, and if you're playing around someone else's, they might have different rules, and so, which is not, there's nothing wrong with that, but it does mean there's not a universal kind of idea of what beats what.
Yeah. So you were saying about adding in the missions as a alternative to actually making any rules changes.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
I don't think it solves all the problems, but I do think it helps a lot, simply because it means that you will have something that looks more like Warhammer on the table again, I think then. And I think that look of the game, which is the critical point I think you made at the beginning, might be restored, because you're going to have some infantry blocks then, at least.
Yeah.
And probably some cav blocks that score, which are a bit different because at least they go faster and etc. So the game will look, I mean, the infantry won't do much apart from stand there or get killed, but at least they'll be on the table.
Yeah.
And that's better than what it is now, where they're not.
Missions are great. I like missions because it means that you're not going to have the same game twice, right? Because if you don't have missions, right, you might come across a Brett army in round 1, and then it will be a different player, but more or less the same Brett army in round 3, and it's like playing the same game twice, right? Whereas if you have missions, then at least you know you've got that variety in your games. But I also think that missions, so that 8th ed event that we went to in Cardiff, right?
Yes.
I think they went a little bit overboard with the missions in that they had lots of objectives on the table for most of the missions.
Yeah.
And I think the objective for when designing the missions should be to try and get more variety within the lists, not just variety of lists. So what I mean by that is to deter people from taking the one-dimensional list. Yeah. So, for example, right, if you take a gun line, a pure gun line, and you want to sit at the back of the board and shoot every game, there'll be some missions where you have to come out of your deployment zone to take an objective, and therefore the gun line will get punished in some of the missions, right? Yes. And similarly, if you take like a Death Star build where you've got one big unit, if there are missions where there's multiple objectives, then your Death Star build is going to get punished for some of those missions, right? But the Cardiff event, I reckon it's like all the missions were designed for an MSU build.
Most of them. Even the Hold the Center one was a bit MSU-y, because normally with Hold the Center, we're getting a bit into our missions here, dear viewers. The classic Hold the Center is you have a central mark and you go in there and you start scoring from turn 2. This is good for a Death Star, because the Death Star goes in, it's confident, and it sits there. Whereas in that one, you just scored at the end of the game. So what you could do is get second turn and then run up a little unit at the end and just hop onto the objective rather than solidly occupying the middle of the table. Yeah. They also didn't have at Cardiff the capture the flags one, which is one where you have to kill your opponent's fortitude. So if I've got an MSU list, multiple smaller units list, where I've got a lot of little flags on my army, then that's the mission I don't like, because I've got a lot where I can give away. Yeah. So I think they just got some internal balance problem there. The Hold the Center mission should have been scoring from turn 2 onwards, and they should have had capture the flags, because both of those are better for a big unit army.
Right. And there needs to be some missions that you can win by playing defensively, right? Yeah. Because it was almost like it was impossible for dwarves to win that tournament, because all the objectives you had to come out of your deployment zone. There has to be a few missions where you can play defensively and still win it, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Dwarves generally of all armies are usually the ones that are hurt a little by missions, and I think I've seen that more or less consistently, kind of across events. You know, which is a shame in itself. But anyway, yeah. So I do think the missions, and there is apparently, and I think someone on my channel commented that they had seen a video on mountain miniatures where they had the mini wargaming dudes, where they had talked about this match play pack coming early next year. And so I think that this is going to happen because they have some insider access there. I know. So they will not have said that without that, I think, at least being at least partly true.
Okay.
So therefore, I do think something will happen. Whether it's a patch and we see actual changes in points values and rewriting of the core rules and all the rest of it. I mean, if I did see that, in a sense, I suppose I couldn't complain, could I? No, I couldn't, is the answer. But at the same time, in a sense, I think the missions will just build in something that I don't think too many people, will kind of object to be honest with you.
No. It would be a shame though if they started changing rules and points values, because we've bought these before hardback books and then all of a sudden they just become obsolete, you know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I do think, one of the questions is really, I suppose, we're sort of complaining a lot about some of the things that are broken with it. And of course, we're comparing new Old World versus patched 8th Ed, which is not a fair comparison because, first of all, 8th Ed had a lot more resources put into it as a game, and then it had all of this patching put into it. So in a sense, it's not going to come out of that comparison, that favorably. But at the same time, actually, doing hard changes to it. I mean, is it that broken that it needs hard changes? And I don't know that I would say yes to that. I think it can be played and it can be enjoyed. And I think some of the changes we're suggesting, like the missions, could make it a lot better. So I don't think it's terminally broken. Not really. There are things in there definitely that are annoying and irritating and that seem clunky and silly, and like this paying for wheel during charge and getting rid of the 1-inch gap rule and that pursuit roll where you actually have to physically move it instead of just looking at the dice. All completely unnecessary nostalgia trips to Warhammer before, the great terrible age of 8th edition where everything died, apparently. Stupid decisions there. They were listening to the 6th Ed people too much when they did that, I'm afraid. Sorry, 6th Ed people. You got a bit too much influence with Old World. I love you, but you got a bit too much of what you wanted there. They shouldn't have done that. 8th Ed was right there. It was right in a few other places as well. And I mean, and even, even the square-based guys, when they had their sort of equivalent podcast as this, How You Fix Old World, much of what they're saying, as well as basically saying that Dr. Blaxill was right, not that he was mentioned on their video, but never mind, he's mentioned here on the streets, was saying, bring back 8th. Right, yeah.
See, you're talking about, I've seen that video, the one where they say, this is what's wrong with Old World.
Yes, and a lot of it amounts to bringing back a lot of 8th edition.
Yeah.
Which is the funny, which I don't know. I don't think you can
do that. I don't think you could do Step Up, for example, because it's just too much of a step back to 8. But
a step back, yes, unintended.
But I think, but dragons, though, I think actually do need addressing in the core rules, because it's not that if you look at how people build their list, right? It's either you're taking dragons or you're changing your list so much in order to defeat a dragon that it's kind of like it's just dragon lists and anti-dragon lists, and the prevalence and the power of dragons is affecting the whole game in a way that's just, it's so overpowering that you're making your list thinking, how am I going to take out the dragon? How am I going to take out the dragon? And it has such a big impact.
It does. Yeah, it does. No, I agree. I mean, just going and looking at tables of Old World and saying, oh, well, there aren't that many dragons. Maybe dragons aren't a problem after all, isn't the point. The fact is the anti-dragon lists are there as well. Yeah. And you might have 2 anti-dragon lists both fighting each other, and you might actually have an okay game of Warhammer because they both prepared for the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So actually it's okay in a weird way.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably why I've had some success with my orcs, because I haven't designed the list to defeat dragons. I've designed it to defeat things like Peg Knights and Dragon Ogres and stuff, which you see a lot of. And if I get lucky and I don't face many dragons, then my list does really well, you know.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there are these slight subtleties which we should acknowledge exist. I mean, you have a war boss and a wyvern, and he's not as good as a dragon, and he will lose to a dragon, but he will beat most other things.
Yeah.
And yet he doesn't cost as many points, and so there is still a sort of certain factor there.
So what I'd really like to see, and I know we're going to have howls of rage in the comments section, but I'd like to bring back. I think cannons should do D6 wounds, and
I honestly he's called D6 wound, guys. He's renamed himself D3+1 rule.
Exactly, and this is. But no, let me hear me out, because this is not for emotional reasons, right? They've added the wounds and the rider up to the wounds of the mount, right? So you've got these 9 wound, 10 wound dragons.
Yeah.
They've got 3 saving throws, and the cannons are only AP2. They've got armor bane as well, but they're only AP2. So, if you've got a 3 up, 5 up, 5 up on your dragon, you hit by a cannonball, you've got 3 5 up saves, and you've got 10 wounds. That's already a massive buff to the dragon.
Huge.
So the fact that the cannon only does D3 wounds just means that you can just totally ignore the cannons.
Yeah.
And when I take cannons, obviously I played dwarves in 8th, right? And I would let's say I take 2 cannons for 240 points. One way, you could think about that in one way and say, look, okay, I've got 240 points worth of artillery, so I want to kill 240 points worth of stuff to get my points value for the cannon. But really, that's the wrong way to think about it, because what you're doing with the cannon is that you're putting these cannons down, and you're forcing the monster to think about what it does.
Yeah.
It can't just charge across the middle of the board, because then it's going to get shot. Yeah. It has to hide behind the hill for a little bit, hide behind the building for a little bit, and then that gives you a tactical advantage in the game. It's not that you're going to kill the dragon. You might get lucky and kill the dragon with a lucky shot, and you'll roll a 6 on the D6 wounds and kill it. But it's the threat of doing the D6 wounds which changes the play of the dragon. And if you've got 3 5 up saves, it's probably not going to wound you anyway, but it could. And it could knock off half your wounds with one shot. And I think just making cannons D6 wounds, and dragons can keep their 3 saving throws and they can keep their 10 wounds. Now, the threat of doing D6 wounds will at least make the dragon have to respect your artillery and think about what it does a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. The threat of, this is the mutually assured destruction doctrine. The threat, it's not about firing the nukes, it's about the threat of what happens if they work. And I agree that a D6 wounds, if a dragon has 9 wounds, D6 wounds is a bit less frightening. But at the same time, it's still significantly more frightening. I mean, the terror is, of course, I think that people, they have this model and it's worth a lot of points, and maybe it's their favorite model and they painted it and all the rest of it. And the fact that the cannon can kill it in one shot, that's the real terror of it. And it might be unlikely, but that's why you're terrified of it. You would like D3+1 wounds or D3 wounds. I mean, you've got 9 or 10. I mean, you're not afraid. And even if, as you say, it's about inducing that fear factor, that the dragon doesn't barrel up the table, and that's what it does. The rational way of using a dragon is to stick it. I mean, look, if you really want to, you can start it behind a hill or a building, but I wouldn't bother. I'd just put it on the line and run up. I mean, you're going to get a turn 2 charge with it pretty much. And that's what it is. It's as simple as that. And so, and the dwarf player probably doesn't bother shooting it because his cannons are going to might score him some points somewhere else. Whereas in the dragon, even if he takes 4 or 5 wounds off it, so what? It's not.
The game should be more tactical than just, if you just put down your big monsters here, dragon, hydra, charybdis, up the board you go. It should be harder than that. You should get punished for just putting monsters down and pushing them up the board. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Or it should be, at the best case scenario, risky. Yeah. Sometimes it works. All right, you got lucky, fine. You get your turn 1, you push them up, you do the damage. But then on another occasion, it doesn't work. And this is, people sometimes used to say this with 8th and Death Stars. Oh, 8th was all just pushing a Death Star up the table. This is rubbish, people who think this. You're wrong. You're wrong. You might have been right for 1 year at the beginning, but you're wrong now. It is the case if your opponent also has a Death Star and they also play this kind of quite low IQ kind of Warhammer. But you don't have to do that. There are all sorts of ways. In addition, not saying Death Stars are necessarily low IQ. They're not. You can have all sorts of different things with them. But but you can build in all of this, these tactics to the to this, and even if you have the most brainless Death Star with all the characters in, and say it's a Witch Star with Hellebron or something, the most powerful Death Star you can think of, and you shove it up the table, and you win some games, and you think it's great, and then someone comes along and dwellers you or something, or you get some cute guy who goes and has a fast thing and gets it in your side or something, and then you lose, and you think, am I going to accept I'm just going to run this Death Star and sometimes win a lot of my games against other players who are doing the same thing and not be able to compete with others who don't? Or am I going to change what I'm doing? Am I going to actually only have 25 Witch Isles and have some other things as well? And unfortunately, the Dragon feels a little bit like that. Kind of the thing it's worried about is is the 360-degree hero, and something with the 360-degree Dragon Slayer hero, it doesn't matter because you can't avoid him anyway. So the Dragon may as well just push itself up the board because it's going to be charged by him.
Yeah, true.
And then it's just going to have to hope it doesn't roll a 6, and then it kills him instead, and that's it.
Yeah.
Which is the way the Dragon meta in Old World has tended to go now against the guy who needs to roll a 6 to kill you, is to make your Dragon so nasty that if he doesn't roll a 6, you kill him. Yeah, so he gets punished for what he's done.
Or the nasty chaos one where it gives you strike last anyway, right?
That's quite clever. The only Bretonians are saved by Syrian's Locket in that regard, because the Chaos Orb with his Ogre Blade, he's not going to kill your Duke in one round because of his dirty little 25-point locket. So you will get 2 chances, probably two, at least one, probably two, to roll your 6 and kill the Dragon. This is why I've been winning these, doing well in these events, guys, because my Duke keeps rolling 6s. I've got 2 Bretonian Dukes. One is the one on the Pegasus who rolls 6s all the time, and the other is the useless fool from at the 8th ed one who, even though he can re-roll his wound rolls because he has an item that lets him do it, he never rolls 6. He's rubbish. It's a bit like my Green Knight. Do you know something? In Old World, my Green Knight has failed to show up on the first time of asking once. Only once. He comes on every single time on the first time of asking. He loves Old World. In 8th ed, oh my God, he's so crotchety. Turn 3, if you're lucky, he comes on. He can't charge. In what I say, one of the blooming Cardiff games, he came on turn 6. I needed him so badly as well. I put all my objectives. My opponent had to get all of these woods and natural terrain. He just needed to come on once, and no, he wouldn't until the end where he appeared and then couldn't move.
Yeah.
If
I were playing Brett's in 8th, I actually wouldn't take the Green Knight. I would.
I'm not taking him anymore. I've had enough. I've had enough of him because he can't, because he can't charge. Let's talk about one of these other things that we were gonna talk about. We talked a lot about some of these, issues.
So here's another idea, right?
Go on. Go for it.
So what about because if you're playing 2,000 points, right?
Yeah,
the Dragon just feels like it's too powerful for a small game. If you're playing a bigger game, the Dragon, it would still be super powerful, but at least there'd be lots of other powerful stuff on the table.
Yeah.
And how about just adjusting the character allowance and adjusting the core allowance? I mean, would that have a big impact, do you think, if it was 33% characters?
So I think the problem with core is a bit different. The problem with core units is that I don't think there are any factions who would pick more than minimum core competitively in Old World. I can't think that there are any core units that are good enough for that. So the core just becomes a bit of a core tax. And the difference is if you have good core, like Bretonians, or bad core, like Warriors of Chaos. So that's not great. As for changing the hero allowance, well, I suppose the real hard play there would be to basically have not so much an allowance, but to make a distinction between lords and heroes, like in 6th ed, and let you have one lord and 2,000 points. And then you'd have to choose level 4 wizard or a combat lord. Yeah. And then that would have a big effect then, definitely. Because
that's like this sort of 1,999 points instead of 2,000, isn't it?
I don't know that all of the lords have got that restriction in them.
Yeah,
1 per 2,000. So you might have to, in essence, yes.
Yeah.
You would let them have a lord. I mean, obviously, it's silly because you want like it's silly to penalize someone for taking a Night Goblin war boss and the same as a Chaos Lord, and that's the slight problem with that, like one lord kind of idea. And they had that problem in Sick Dead, I should say, as well. It didn't matter that you were only allowed not very many with Chaos, because that was all you were going to have anyway. But if you had goblins, then it was more of a problem. I think that would be the hard distinction. Stop people with a level 4 or a lord. You could do that. I mean, you can say not double dragon if you like, I guess. But
you could limit unit size in terms of points, right? So you could say no unit, whether it's infantry, cavalry, or a character, is more than 300 points or something.
Yeah, I mean, probably 450 or 500 would
or 400 points,
or whatever it would be.
Yeah,
you could, but I suspect if you did that, it would be good though for some. So if you said no 400, it's great for Brett because your Duke is about 380 points. So he's all right. And then the dragon. And then the dragon is not so good for him, obviously.
Yeah,
so there would be all of these throttle points where it would probably benefit some factions a bit more than others.
Yeah, always, yeah.
Which is, I guess, one of the sort of innate, issues with it, and that's in a sense where some of the if you make fixes and you change it in this way, and everyone has got their ideas of whether it's this being limited, that being limited, all sorts of different things. You will alienate groups of people because you're probably going to have it so that one faction gets hurt more than others.
Yeah.
And that annoys people when they, when that happens. And this is just innate, I think, to fan comp systems of games. And when you have a benevolent dictator just saying it's like this because it is, and people can't affect them through lobbying, then in a sense people make their bed and they lie in it. Whereas if it's fan changes, people get angry inevitably.
Well, let's talk about a comp system then, because
why not?
The comp system that we've been playing in 8th Ed over these years has been one that doesn't actually change the core rules in any way. It just penalizes people in terms of tournament points, or gives you bonuses for tournament points if you're taking something that is rarely seen.
Yeah. So to explain a little more about this is it's a certain kind of comping. It all works around the 20-0 scoring system, and it works on the assumption that you are playing 5 rounds and you get a change to your overall score of points added or deducted based upon your overall comp score. And everything in the game has, well, not everything, but all of the armies have certain units that give them pluses, which are softer picks, and minuses, which are harder picks. And so it might be the case that I might take a +3 Bretonia list to a tournament. That means I'm going to get 3 points added on to however many battle points I've got. Remember that each battle you can get up to 20 points in. So it's not a huge change, but it can often make the difference in a lot of ways. And the cool thing with this is that not only do you get, obviously, people being encouraged and incentivized to pick weak things to get plus points, and slightly discouraged from taking filth to avoid the negative points, you also gain this, so long as the comp system has good credibility, and there are arguments about it, of course, there will inevitably, but it has good credibility, you've got then this common language. I can say, oh, this list that I've got here is -2, and what you're playing is -2. So roughly we're equal. Whereas then if I play a +7 list and Simon plays a -2 list, then in theory, at least, he's got a much stronger army than I have. And so then if I only lose that game slightly against him, I kind of feel, well, actually, I did all right there, given that my own army was, at a significant disadvantage. And this just creates a common language of balance, which can be used to change tournaments slightly and incentivize and disincentivize, and just gives you kind of an idea in a quantifiable way of what's kind of filthy and what isn't. That just enables people to have unbalanced games or balanced games of fantasy, depending on what they fancy. And that just wonderfully liberating.
Yeah, and if you take Bretonia as an example, right, in an old world context, it could be something like, if you've got more than 6 Peg Knights, then you're on a -1 to comp or something.
Yes.
But then again, if you take something that's not seen, like questing knights or knights errant, maybe you're getting a + to comp for taking those. And so,
Precisely.
yeah, so you might be able to play it off and say, take some minus hits by taking lots of vanguarding peg knights and have a minus, and then counterbalance that by taking some questing knights to get a plus.
Exactly. These were all how this. I mean, there's one comp system. I mean, the popular one we called was conceived by Triple Crown Wargaming. Is say in 8th ed, and there's no reason why, in theory, something like this couldn't emerge in Old World. Of course, this requires everyone to know a lot about what's good and what's bad on gaming tables. Otherwise, the comp probably might not be correct. Yeah. I feel as though we already now as a community have a pretty good idea of what's good and what isn't. But occasionally someone goes and brings something that's discovers something new, even in a meta which is, I think, quite flat like this. We've had this 90 goblin poison shot unit. It's the reinvention of an old idea. You had that in 8th ed, by the way. They were just Savage Orcs that did it. And they had the same banner with a little goblin on the side. And you had, I faced that 100 of them quite a few times against my regular opponent. And they've reinvented it. Someone has reinvented it in Old World. And surprise, surprise, it's also really good. So that, for example, might have not been comped before. And then someone goes and does it. And then maybe it gets comped as a response. So there is a little bit of an arms race, but it's part of the challenge, of course, to find something that's pretty good, that's not that much comped. And
there'll always be someone who's trying to break the comp by a good list with a high comp score.
Yeah, you are, and there can be a bit of meta chasing there, of course, and a bit of 3D printers going into action and contrast paint being slopped out onto things, which is something that neither we both don't like. Yeah. But to an extent that is inevitable.
Yeah,
some degree.
I was going to ask you about that point though, because obviously you were making a few quips about the printers and the contrast paints and stuff.
Yes.
And you were almost sounding apologetic in your video, where you sort of said, "Look, I don't want to sound morally superior to you, but I don't like to sort of play the chasing meta game, right?"
Yeah.
But of course, just because you're printing something doesn't mean you're chasing the meta, and just because you've got old metal models doesn't mean you're not chasing the meta, right?
No.
You could, so it could work both ways.
It could, but the tools. Oh yeah, absolutely. You could be festooned with crucifixes and still be a wicked heretic. I mean, there can be all sorts of things that you can have. I think the thing is that one thing that's changed, I think, about the hobby now, for a variety of reasons, 3D printers are important, and so are contrast paints. So I think it's just the amount of money people spend on the hobby. I think that's changed too. People can make armies fast, man, and that has changed, I think.
But I agree with you in principle, because there is a fundamental difference between, and obviously the internet has facilitated this, the difference between making your list first and then obtaining the models, and painting an army and then making a list from the models that you have. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that almost menu-based kind of way of conceiving of, as I say, Warhammer has really, really changed things. I mean, as you say, it's a romantic idea of acquiring a collection of, model soldiers over time, and them also maybe this is a metal nostalgia thing. The fact that they almost feel as though they're quite permanent because they're metal, especially if they cost you quite a lot to buy as well, and they're not just a flippant thing. Like I've got my, my 72 Linehammer dwarves in that box, and they're horrible 3D printed models. And I mean, I hate the damn things. They're awful. They shouldn't exist. I'm very, actually, to be honest, I'm probably pretty morally absolute. I'm basically saying burn the heretic here. And of course, I'm just lucky at the moment that my Bretonians happen to just basically be the meta list. And so it's a bit like going and saying, the hipster going and saying, hey, I was wearing this before it became cool, so it's mine.
I remember when about a year ago today, when before Old World was released, when there was all the discussions online, and they were releasing these almanacs, and people were sort of having quite heated arguments about what may or may not happen with the rule, and getting a bit emotional about it. And I remember kind of looking at these discussions online, and you'd see the word gatekeeper being thrown around.
Yes.
And I didn't really know what the word meant. And so I would look in the comments and try and figure out what was going on. And I would often find myself sympathizing with the person who was being called a gatekeeper. Right?
Yes, definitely.
And it's not because, obviously, I don't want to say to anyone, the hobby's not for you, right? But at the same time, I don't want all standards to be obliterated. So it's complete free for all.
Yeah.
So, and obviously, people are coming from different places, right? And people are coming from 8th Ed and 9th Age and 40K and AOS and so on. And everyone's coming together into the same game, and so no one's going to get everything they want, right? Everyone has to compromise, including myself, and I'm still upset about the base size changes, and it's like
but the thing with, I think, the gatekeeper there, though, is in a sense you're sort of right that if there was no gatekeeper and there was no gate, then well, there would be problems. So then the question is, who gets to be the gatekeeper? And if I was saying, I would say the people who are already in the field to start with should control the gate. They were there before.
Well, that's what I mean. So look,
yes,
I mean, obviously the 3D,
I'm the farmer. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned 3D printing, right? Yes. And so when I see dwarf armies now, if I go to any old world event, there are more 3D printed dwarves than there are Games Workshop dwarves, right? Yes. Just that I see the armies around. And they have these lovely dwarves from, I think they're Highland Miniatures, or I think that's the name. And they look actually really nice.
I know the ones you mean, yeah.
They look really nice. The aesthetic is great, but they're just a little bit too big.
Yeah.
Because the base sizes have gone up, they fit fine on the bases now because the base sizes have gone up. But they look bigger than my dwarves, and they kind of, I don't know, I just don't like it. And it's not, I don't want to say to anyone you can't use those dwarves, and they do look fine. It's just, if I were to bring my Games Workshop dwarves and put them on the same table, there'd be a slight mismatch in scale.
Yes, and it's something that slightly disrupts the kind of immersion of the whole kind of experience, because even though they're different manufacturers or different eras of models, there's a feeling that the dwarf, the anatomy should kind of be the same, the height should be the same, that I feel as though they could all come from the same kind of universe.
Yeah.
And you get this in a small way sometimes there are some models I love, the dragons from the 80s, and they're just too small to be even near any 8th Ed, whatever. And they don't quite somehow work. There are those stylistic things. And I mean, these are quirks and foibles, but I mean, but I do think it's true that in order for the sort of spirit of Warhammer to be retained, that I do think something that could be called gatekeeping might need to happen. You could have said that Nigel Stillman was a gatekeeper in his way. He wasn't saying you have to do this, but he was still, making what he was saying kind of analogous to saying, well, this is the ultimate spirit of wargaming. This is how you should be a good sport, all the rest of it. And so therefore the inverse of that is that if you're not doing the things he says, perhaps he thinks you're not quite as good as him. And so, you could say that was gatekeeping.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's like all of these things, on the internet, I'm sure there is clearly a problem with certain kind of behavior that's too exclusionary, but at the same time, there is also a role for upholding certain, aesthetic and standards of sportsmanship, whatever, according to your taste. They're norms and values that exist within, a sort of a kind of a, normative social system. I mean, it's hardly a surprise. I mean, the idea that they just can't be there is ridiculous. Of course they should be. It's a question of not of being a gatekeeper, but of, who controls the gate and what their admissions policy is, really. And if it's inclusive and democratic, then that's fine. But there's still a gate there.
So what do you think of having a painting requirement for a tournament then? Because I've been to different things now, where there's some that have painting requirements. And when I say painting requirement, I don't necessarily mean you have to have all your models painted, but there'll be some kind of benefit of painting them or disbenefit for not painting them. Because I think when you have no painting requirement at all, you see different types of armies.
Yes.
Because what happens is it kind of opens the door to the meme list. Because
Yeah,
someone can create a list that ordinarily you might play it for 5, maybe 10 games, and then
yeah,
you're probably going to get bored of it because it's a bit one-dimensional.
yeah,
Whereas if you're forced to paint your army, you're forced to
yeah.
invest time in that army, and so you're not going to paint something that you're going to get bored of after 10 games.
Right. So that's what happened with my Linehammer list, right? So
Yeah.
if I had no painting requirement, turn up with that. But
Yeah.
because I can't be bothered to paint it, the horrible thing stays in the box, which is where it should be because
Yeah.
it's horrible.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, I think for a long time, for as long as I had been playing before Old World, there was a kind of a three colors and basing equals to painted, and that was there was an understanding there. And you can get something that it's not going to look good if that's all you do, but it's still better than unpainted, and that seemed to be almost universally accepted. And again, oh, this is a moral standard point. I think I don't mind penalizing people who don't do that. I wouldn't go any further than that. I wouldn't give extra points to people who are, better at painting or anything. Wouldn't do that. But I do think the 3 colors and basing, it to me seems that was fairly universally accepted before. And that meant that you didn't get unpainted armies. But at the same time, I don't know if people ever felt excluded by that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought so, because it's a very low bar.
Yeah. So, for example, the Triple Crown guys, they did tournament points, didn't they, for painting?
Yeah.
It was like 10 tournament points or something.
10. If you did that, the requirement I just mentioned there, you got 10 extra tournament points. And if you had like a few unpainted models, you lost a couple or something. And I think that was fairly uncontroversial for the most part.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably fine, to be honest. And I think that's probably what I would do.
Yeah, it was a deciding factor, isn't it? So if it's like you're close on points with someone at the end, but you haven't really painted all your army, then you would drop down a few points.
Usually players who hadn't painted all their whole armies were usually players who weren't to be found near the top of a tab anywhere, because they were usually people who just thought, oh, I'll go down for this weekend and play, and my troops aren't all painted, but I don't really care about the painting points. And that's the kind of person who I do think should be allowed to play in an event.
Of course.
But at the same time, they're not bothered about getting those extra few points, and so I don't think they mind.
Yeah,
I think that's
the fun way I saw. Sorry, as you said, there was a fun way I saw in some tournament packs a long time ago where painted models got the hatred special rule against unpainted models, which I thought was quite a cool way of doing it.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did see that as well. Yeah. I think that the alienation of various groups things, though, I think this was another thing we were going to talk about. Is one thing with Old World that I think is very important is how who you are and where you came from in relation to it. This is a very reiterative game. There aren't very many completely new players. You probably either came from 40k or Age of Sigmar, and if you did, you probably don't have too many strong views about what Warhammer Fantasy should be, because it's a very different system you're coming from. Or you came from an old edition of Fantasy, and there are 2 main factions there. One of them is 8th edition, and 9th Age and WAP, incidentally, but still 8th Ed is bigger than those 2. And the other, I think, is 6th edition.
Yeah.
7th edition is more similar to 6th edition, of course, in its nature, and it doesn't have so many supporters now, but it's those 2 particularly. And they're the 2, I think, where you see most of the disagreements when people are arguing about Linehammer and saying, oh, well, should we bring back Step Up? It will be the 6th Ed people that say, no, you can't have Step Up. That takes away initiative, because they like, and there are good arguments for not having Step Up, by the way. I don't mean to trivialize that, but there's a certain way they think about how the game should be played. Whereas the 8th Ed people, I think that they're used to like abbreviated games slightly, in that they like that 8th Ed, of course, had pre-measuring in it from the beginning. And you have these long charges, closest to closest, everything being free. Pursuit's easy, you just roll the dice, and so there are those abbreviations, and the game is more fluid in that regard. And I think that people's attitudes in Old World and how they feel it should be fixed, if it needs fixing, will come back to that. Like the sixth ed people, as I said before, they'll tend to think, oh, just fix infantry by giving them more static combat res. Whereas the eighth ed people will say, no, you need to bring back step up and have the second rank fighting and everything, so infantry actually kill things.
Gosh.
And I think a lot of this just comes down to the kind of Warhammer that you like, and you grew up with, probably, or that you. And I think that that's just a slight difference in perspective that both sides have to get used to. I mean, I'm very much on one side of the fence. But I do think there is a reason why you should be on the eighth ed side of the fence. Let me tell you what it is. Now, one difference, I think, is that while there were sixth edition tournaments and you can play competitive sixth, and by the way, I would love to play more competitive sixth. Competitive sixth edition, I think, is a very mature, very interesting game with all sorts of dynamics in it. And I've only just tantalizingly seen some of it. It's interesting. It's a very, very good edition of the game, without question. But 8th edition was played, I think, conceptualized from the beginning with tournaments in mind. The tournament scene, when 8th Ed came out in 2010, already existed. It was already big enough. And so they made it a bit more robust from the beginning because they were anticipating that it was going to be played not by gits, but not necessarily by two gentlemen at the local hobby shop. And I'm not saying that 6th Ed had none of that technical correction in it, because I don't think that's true. I do think it did have a lot more than 5th edition had in it before. But 8th Ed was made much more for competitive players in mind. So it's not really a surprise that I think it worked better as a competitive game than I think 6th Ed did. And that's why I think if you want to look at Old World competitively, 8th Ed is a better drawing place than 6th Ed. As a game overall, for everybody, that goes out the window. That's a whole bunch of more individual esoteric perspectives there. I can see a lot of arguments for 6th Ed there. I'm talking about purely as a competitive game.
Yeah. I suppose you're putting 9th Age in the 8th Ed bracket then.
Yes, because 9th Age is a love letter to 8th edition.
Sure.
Pretty much. Yeah. It's 8th Ed. It's 8th Ed fixed. It has infantry throwing loads of attacks. These closest to closest, roll the dice, charging. Magic is toned down, but it has that fluidity that 8th Ed has that 6th Ed doesn't quite have. And Old World sort of has fluidity. If you're a skirmisher, then you can go wherever you like. But if you're infantry, you kind of can't move. So 8th Ed, Old World is kind of super fast or super slow, depending on who you are. Whereas in 6th Ed, it's all a bit slower, generally speaking. Yeah. And in 8th Ed, it's all a lot faster.
So obviously, because there are some 8th Ed players and many 9th Ed players who are just not playing the Old World now.
Yes, quite a lot.
What about
I don't think they're on the Facebook group either, by the way, guys. So when you do your poll, what's better, 6th Ed or 8th Ed, or what, and everyone, 6th Ed comes up with 95% of the vote. That's who's on your group.
Yeah.
Because the 6th Ed people like Old World and the 8th Ed, 9th Age people don't like it to such an extent. Anyway, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask that question. I mean, if you knew to what extent that exists in the 6th Ed crowd, to what extent are there 6th Ed players who don't want to play Old World?
I think and I'm not talking for my tribe here. I think the attitude of 6th Ed players is something like this. But Old World is really good and we love that it exists and everything, but 6th Ed is still better. Not necessarily by loads and loads. I still think they think it's better. And I say that in a sense and that they're all it's all very well to go and say, you go play 8th Ed, you go play 6th Ed, you play one. There's a whole thing about, you've got to play a supported game. There are all sorts of advantages. And I think that there is a certain thinking amongst the 6th Ed players that Old World has purged. No, I'm going to be a bit provocative. A lot of the things they didn't like about 8th edition back to whence they came. And so they've got an edition of the game that they probably never thought they would get when 8th Ed was there. They probably thought that a lot of the things they liked about 6th Ed had just gone, and unexpectedly, as I say, they've got them back. And so I think that's probably their their view overall. And you see that very often.
Positions we're in then, in that we're playing 8th and Old World.
Yes, we are, and I would play 6th as well, because I'm not I'm actually pro 6th in the sense that I think it is a very, very good game, and it comes from I think, a high point in Warhammer history. And if you want to go back to the year 2000 or something, where it was a great time to be a fantasy fan, and also they were pushing out loads of releases, loads of cool new models. They'd just gone into the Grimdark. I don't like Grimdark, by the way, but if you're a fan of that aesthetic, that's what they were doing then. It's a great place to put your time tunnel to in Warhammer. And it's interesting for that reason. But as I say, when push comes to shove, when we put them both on the table, as I say, I prefer 8th, and I think it's a better competitive game. But at the same time, though, I'd play any old edition. It's all Warhammer at the end of the day, and that's the main thing. For me.
So moving on a little bit to our sort of discussion about gatekeeping and
yes,
and sort of designing an event. I mean, how would you? To what extent do the models matter within the gameplay? So I'll give you some examples. So people would have this. What you see is what you get in terms of like what the models are equipped with, right? So if somebody rocks up with 20 dwarves with hand weapon and shield and tells me at the start of the game they've got great weapons, obviously that's not going to bother me that much, right? And I think most people aren't going to be upset, right?
Yeah.
But then again, you had your example about the geezer with the 2 dragons and 2 frost hearts, where he's rocking the 2 frost hearts together.
Yes.
With the sticks coming up and there's no birds on the top.
Yeah.
Well, if the models have big wings, then surely they shouldn't be able to go right next to each other. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. You would think, wouldn't you, that the stacking would be an issue if they go around, because 2 frost hearts shouldn't be, because they have a wingspan, right? They don't hover. They're not
and
like
dragons. I remember seeing on your picture. Did the dragons not have wings attached?
No, they didn't have wings.
That's
amazing. You need to be able to stick it all together, right? Like Ultrazor.
Yeah.
Because that's it. It's like modular. It's modular. You don't need wings.
That was incredible. And when your Duke went in and killed the 2 birds, I was like, oh my God. You know what that reminded me?
That was funny. It was karma, man. Yeah.
Have you ever read the old 4th Ed High Elf book about the stories of Enarion, the first Phoenix King?
Yes.
When he's fighting the 4 greater demons at once, Do you remember that story where he's got the Bloodthirster, the Lord of Chaos?
Vaguely. I have read that book.
The Great Unclean One, and he cuts the Lord of Change in 2.
Yeah.
Grabs the Keeper of Secrets, and then he slices open the Great. It was like, yeah.
Maybe all of the greater demons, that would be really unfluffy as well, because they all hate each other and they all decided to form into a modular block.
Yeah.
All went against one elf. And then obviously he just killed all of them because they all came at the same time, the fools.
That was the heroic killing blow, like one.
Yeah, indeed. The heroic X4 heroic killing blow of our time.
Yeah.
I think the point about WYSIWYG, well, look, I mean, as someone who rocks as you do very old models that might not have the same actual equipment option as the modern one does, I think we have to allow some liberalism with that, because otherwise you're not going to get a lot of things in there. So I think actual equipment options, I feel that you have to just sort of, in a sense, take the word of the person who has it. I mean, but there are limits though. If someone ranked up a bunch of orcs with like great weapons and said they've got bows. Oh, that's a bit more. I would accept it, but at the same time, it feels as though the bow isn't quite fungible with melee weapon, whereas a great weapon could be a hand weapon and shield, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So
on my Savage Orcs, I've got like 50 of them painted. Some of them have hand weapon and shield, some of them have spears, some of them have bows, right?
Yeah.
And when I'm playing them with spears, I'll move the ones with spears to the front rank, and the ones behind will have different things. And I'll say, look, they've got spears. You can see most of them have spears. And
that's a great. I think that's a great solution. I think. Yeah. I think it's nice. I think the reason why the bow and the missile weapon and the melee weapon are a bit different is what you want at least the passing player to know that's a missile unit or that's a melee unit, so they're able to ascertain the circumstances of the battle. I don't know. Maybe this is quite esoteric. I like to pass a game of Warhammer that I'm not playing in and be able to understand what's happening in the game and there to be some clarity to it. that I really like that, because it just gives you a way of interacting with battles that you're not playing in. And obviously, if lots of troops all are actually not the things that they're supposed to be, or don't have weapons that even correspond to their role in the game, then you don't really get that. And so even if it's as simple as that's a monster, that's a cavalry, that's a melee infantry, and that's a bow infantry, that's probably about the level I think it should probably be on. But maybe those standards aren't universal.
Yeah, I mean, on the kind of stack hammer thing, where you're putting the two models together and forcing your opponent to charge two things at once.
Yeah, this is an old world thing, by the way, dear viewers. It's because you're obliged to go in on a charge by the nearest possible route, which is a little thing they just put in there. I don't think they thought about it, because they were thinking, oh, we don't want like that nasty cheesy guy to go and like stick his hero on one side of something so we can get a dirty little overrun. We just make him go in by like the shortest possible route. So then actually then the guy who is being charged puts both his frost hearts together, so the shortest route can tax both of them, so you fight both frost hearts and not one.
Yeah. And I mean, the first time I came across that was against Sam's Giants. So he had his two.
That was the first time I saw it in your battle report against. I did not realize it.
Yeah, I mean, the two giants, the models fit together fine. They don't bump shoulders, and I could imagine two giants standing next to each other. It didn't seem like it was that crazy, but I couldn't really imagine two dragons sort of linking arms and flying around together.
No, I think that's true. I mean, it's also partly. I mean, look, they were the giants of Albion, right? There were two giants in a box who were, so, you should have to engage Bollogs and Catchcore, right? They're best mates, right? It seems fine. Whereas, as you say, dragons don't really like other dragons, right? They're completely individualistic, vain creatures, and they would hate the idea of like ponying up with another dragon. Whereas giants, they might do that. So, because at least the stack hammer, horrible though it is, it looks unpleasant, but at least there is a certain strategy to it that, both of the models, the monsters, or whatever it is, they cover each other, right? They give each other mutual protection. That's not thematically inoffensive to me, like Linehammer is.
Right, yeah.
Because Linehammer is a ridiculous abstraction that doesn't seem to make any sense, whereas Stackhammer, I mean, if one giant is standing next to another giant and my guy charges one of the giants, probably the other giant does go into combat as well.
Yeah.
It makes sense. I mean, it not least because, even a giant will know that if there are two of me fighting that guy, we're going to stand a better chance if he just picks on us one by one. So I do think that there is some sense there. But anyway, getting back though, to that point about the alienation of different groups, I do think that whatever changes you bring into Old World, you will annoy one group a bit more than others. And as I say, most of those changes that involve bringing back elements of 8th edition will annoy the sick-ed crowd more for obvious reasons. And I do think that's very much the tone of the online commentary I can see on it, that some people really have it in for 8th edition and they don't like most of the things that changed about 8th, and they're happy that they've been taken out and they don't want them coming back in. Yeah. But I would beseech such persons to ask themselves why those changes were brought in 8th edition in the first place. I can say it wasn't just stylistic sort of quirks by Jervis Johnson. I think many of these changes were brought in for a reason, which was to make infantry better. And that's why what's gone around is coming around, and why a lot of the most elegant solutions involve bringing back elements of 8th edition, because that was what the original, recipe was in the first place. When they said, let's fix infantry, that's what they came up with.
And infantry should be the bread and butter of the game, isn't it? Most people want it to be.
Yeah, I think so. I'm a cav player, and I think infantry should be.
Yeah. 8th edition, it had so many what you used to call sort of quality of life improvements.
Yeah,
things like the charges measuring from closest to closest, and when they break, it's whoever gets the most on the dice, and then they cut down where they stand instead of doing this clunky pursue thing and things like that, which the feel of the game when you play 8, it's proper like boom, bang, crash. It's like crazy stuff happening, and it's fast, and it's like, yeah, it's swingy, and Old World seems more measured when you play it, and it's good in the sense that you don't get the huge swings, and you get closer games, and you often get close to results at the end of it. And it's a bit more forgiving in that you're not going to lose your big unit into one crushing combat. But at the same time, it's kind of, it makes it a bit slow, isn't it? I mean, we're playing 2,000-point games at an event, and even after 3 hours, people aren't finishing their games.
Sometimes.
And it's like 8th ed, you would play 2,500 points, and a lot of them would
in the same
finish
time.
quicker. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I think that's true. I think the way in which Old World can be massively abbreviated is, of course, dragons and dragon slayers. If you have them, then the games can be over fast. And believe me, with my Bretonians, some of my games have been like the Ultrazord list, the 2 double dragon, double frost heart. I think he was dead in 70 minutes. It was over, man. I mean, I had all this time after the round because it was just so brutal. But if you don't have those, you're right. It does feel a lot more pedantic, a bit slower, more measured. That, in its way, that is a stylistic nod back to what Warhammer used to be like before 8. I don't have a problem with that. It's a bit like, I love cricket, and I can understand why some people like limited overs cricket, where it's a bit more, crash bang all over the place, and some other people like the more sedate pace of test cricket. There's a beauty to be seen in both of those, I think. And so I don't mind that as such, but there is definitely, unless you take away those death matches in Old World where I need to roll a 6 and you need to roll a 6 to kill each other, those which I don't really like, although they're exciting. I don't look, Russian roulette is exciting, guys, but it's a bad idea to play it. There aren't so many key moments that feel really important in Old World, especially also because the magic isn't, for the most part, super powerful with every spell, or there aren't as many really powerful spells, even though cumulatively they are powerful. There are many dramatic moments in games of 8th ed that have you, let's put it like this, after some games of 8th ed, I basically needed to change my shirt afterwards because I've just got through so much sweat because they were just so harrowing. Whereas in Old World, I don't see that happening. Sorry. I can see a bit where someone says, "Yeah, roll a 6," and I'm like, "No," and that's the game over.
So also, when it comes to, let's say we were to run an Old World event, right? Obviously, we need to think about it more than just sort of off the cuff on this video. But like, let's say we introduced a comp system, which added pluses and minuses for the good and bad stuff. We also had objectives that were different in each game. Would you think that would be sufficient to kind of fix the issues of the game, or do you think you would actually need a few house rule changes on top of that?
I think with that and a couple of house rule changes, I think the way I would more put it would be, I think it would be as good as Old World could be. And I think that's the important way of thinking about it. It would be to get Old World to its final state where it was made as beautiful and as graceful and as elegant as it could possibly be. I don't think that evolved version at the end of its evolution tree would be as good as 8th edition. Not even close, I'm afraid. But that is the true comparator. It is not, but I think the gap would be closed enormously. And there will be some ways in which the new evolved Old World maybe was better even than the evolved 8th edition. And so that's the real comparison. That's where I'm interested in getting Old World to the moment where we can judge it in posterity. And as I say, I think it's about making it as good as it can be. And some people might really like that version of the game as good as it can be and might think it's the best version of the rules ever. And that's fine. But at least I think they would be having that opinion while the comparison was a fair one. They would be looking at comparing this hopefully to, the final version of 8th, the final version of 6th.
Yeah.
And the things I didn't like about Old World then would more be stylistic things I didn't like just that I didn't like the magic or whatever, or I didn't like the role of infantry. And those would be more things to taste rather than things that I just think are just basically need to be changed for the good of the game. And I think that's where I'd like to see it go. And I think that probably is possible.
Yeah, I think in terms of like you say, the comp system and the missions would do a lot to change. Just well, first of all, you'd make it more fun, right? Because you'd have more variety in there. It would balance the types of lists that people bring.
Yeah.
And like I say, it would make each game different, so you're not just like playing the same cookie cutter list all the time. I still think there would still be some gaps though with regards to infantry still not playing as much as a role, because okay, you've got objectives, but you can still take objectives with cavalry models, right?
Yeah.
And I think infantry would still need a buff,
maybe
in some way.
It depends what you want them to do. I mean, because again, players from before 8th don't mind infantry just sort of being there and being kind of hard to shift, but not doing much fighting. Whereas the 8th ed player actually wants infantry in the mix. They actually want to see them doing fighting. And that's an aesthetic. I think that's a bit of an aesthetic thing, really. And it's sort of to taste.
I agree with some infantry, though, isn't there? It's not like if you look at, I mean, I used High Elves as an example before, right? They've got Silver Helms and Dragon Princes and Illyrian Reapers. So they've got 3 types of. I don't think there's any more I'm forgetting, right? They've got 3 types.
3 types of cavalry, and all of them are a bit different. Yeah,
all of them are a bit different, and you'll see them in High Elf armies in Old World. But they've got even more types of infantry, right? They've got spearmen and archers and white lions and phoenix guard,
sea guard as well,
shadow warriors and sea guard and all the rest of it, right? And so, if at the moment you're only going to see if it's just to take an objective or something,
spearmen, or I'm probably archers. I think more so,
maybe archers,
because the archers are a little bit less redundant.
Yeah.
I think that's what you'd see.
But I think I would like to see a role for those elite infantry.
Yeah, and I agree with you. That's where it's hard. And the role of the elite infantry would, I think, have to be not just that they're stubborn or something, and that they're just harder to shift. That they actually, do something interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in 8th ed, to use all these examples, I mean, it's very easy for us to say what the differences are. I mean, you've got, okay, so what are Phoenix Guard good for? Well, they have a 4-up ward. So they have a real defensive utility. They also fight in an extra rank as well. So they are incredibly resilient and tanky. White Lions, they hit a bit harder because they've got these sort of double-handed axes, and they've also got, in the previous editions, White Lions had some interesting rules to do with the different axe strokes that the axemen could use as well, which were kind of cool. Like there was one they could use against multi-wound targets, and another more defensive kind of posture they could use against cavalry. Sword masters. So again, they've got the speed and they've got the hitting power, but they go down super easily.
Yeah. Actually, to be honest, though, sword masters do have a little place in Old World because they can be initiative 7 on the first round of combat.
Yeah,
they get charged by cavalry and still fight first.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a role for them there in a way. I mean. So there are all those different varieties. I mean, and then you look at the High Elf cavalry. You've got the Reavers, the fast cab, Silver Helms are sort of in the middle, and then Dragon Prince is elite cab, and you've got all of those different. They all feel very different on the table, which is just nice, really nice to see. And
so one fix you could do. I mean, you could just say that all infantry get the fighting extra ranks rule if you're behind a model in base to base, right?
Yeah.
So it just gives them a bit more chance to strike back if they're charged by cavalry, right? So, I mean, let's say you've got a simple example: 5 Marauder Horsemen are charging 10 Halberdiers, right? The 5 Marauder Horsemen charging, and they kill 5. Let's say it's the 10 Halberdiers are in 2 ranks of 5, yeah?
Yeah.
The first 5 get killed by the Marauder Horseman charge. Now, if those Halberdiers were in a line of 10, the other 5 would get to strike back.
Of course.
But why not just let them strike back if they're still in a 5x2 formation? Do you see what I mean?
Oh, I agree. But I fear that there's someone else in the room at the moment. I think hello, 8th edition. Yeah,
I'm not saying remove
I know.
the fighting rank. I'm not saying remove the rule where the whole fighting rank can fight. I'm just saying add an extra supporting attack from the second rank if you're behind base to base model.
Yeah, but you see, I suppose what we might as well be saying is, I have a suggestion. Let's just have base to base for the first rank and have the second rank, and let's have step up. Wait, there we go. And then we just, I think the thing is
But the fighting extra ranks rule is a rule in the Old World book. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You're not kind of going back to a previous edition.
True. It exists if you have a spear. It's spearmen, right? They have that.
Yeah.
That's where it comes from, right? There's not any other troop that gets by an extra rank.
There are some. I think one of the high elf units and
okay.
Yeah, there are some.
So there are a few. Yeah, I think a lot of these, I think all of these would improve the game, but I think a lot of them amount to much the same. To be honest,
it's not going to make a radical difference. No.
Look, I think if you had step up and you had 2 ranks fighting, I do not think infantry would dominate Warhammer the Old World. I think they would get, if you just made that change, if Games Workshop pronounced from their pylon, they said from this moment onwards, infantry are all getting fight an extra rank, and there's step up. I don't think that suddenly infantry would dominate competitive
because they're not maneuverable enough.
No, they're not maneuverable enough. I think they would not die anywhere near as often. I think monsters and heroes probably would not want to charge them.
Yeah.
But I don't think they would be dominant. No. And that would be with an absolutely transformational buff, and they still wouldn't be, I don't think.
Yeah. But yeah, they would definitely have a much bigger role though. Yeah.
Yeah, they would. They'd have a much bigger role, and I think that would change the game in some, quite a lot of interesting ways. But I think though what we've kind of come down to this with philosophically is, look, they made a lot of calls. You and I don't like them, but we have our version of the game that we like, and we have to remember that that's by no means universal. And I think that perhaps one thing we both kind of want in a way is for them to actually be true to their own design intentions, in that they've made these calls with Old World. We might not agree with them, but making the game as good as it can be within those design changes would be the thing that interests me the most. And it would be when a new version of the rules came out, which might only be 2 or 3 years away, that I would like to see a much more major change. And that's at that point where I do think they need to smell the coffee and realize that a lot of the changes they put in for 8th edition from 7th edition were for the right reasons. And sure, 8th ed had many sins, and just because you put back some of the fixes like to infantry they had in 8th ed doesn't mean you have to repeat those sins. There are ways of going around it, with like step up, you can have other ways of making initiative meaningful, like, for example, not automatically striking first on the charge like you used to in old editions. You can have other rules like making step up contingent if you want. There are ways you can do it, basically.
Yeah.
So, that's the point where I think the real major fix kind of comes in. And there's more of, I think, an equilibrium reached between 6th edition, 8th edition, the new changes in Old World, and then maybe some of the fan editions like WAP and the 9th Age, and where there's genuinely a real synthesis between all of those different versions of the game, and maybe a sort of postmodern evolved version of Warhammer, might actually emerge, which genuinely takes the best parts from all of the different systems. And I know that was their injunction with Old World, but I don't think that's what they did. I think they made 6th edition with a few changes, and good as 6th edition was, some of the changes brought to it, especially in 8th, that I do think were needed for a reason, and that's why they went.
It's not even that they started with 6th, it's that they started with we don't want 8th.
Yes, I agree. They started from that position, and I think that's that's reflected in the product that they ended up getting. They started from not liking 8th and started from not liking magic, and this is what they've ended up with, and it's not a surprise. But there you go. But I think there's every reason to be optimistic about it. The way I think of playing Warhammer is not to just go and say, oh, it's not very good at the moment, so I'm not going to play anymore. The wind might not be blowing the way you might like at the moment, but Warhammer's still around, and it's it's still objectively a very good game. Make it as good as it can be and enjoy that, and maybe try and lobby for the changes that you want in the next edition, and keep playing old editions as well, because they're fun too. Don't just forget about them just because they're not the current edition. There's nothing wrong with old editions of Warhammer, just like there's nothing wrong with old movies. You know, they've got a big role to play.
And people watching this video might think, you know, these old fogies rattling on about some old edition, but we play Old World, you know, and I want to be a part of Old World. And I don't want to be that guy who's moaning about stuff.
No.
But at the same time, I can't unlearn what I know about other editions.
Yeah, you know, this is yeah, it's the paradox of the old man, isn't it? I mean, you know, it's always like this. I mean, you know, you can't be a prisoner to the past and be so dominated by it that you can't see anything else. You know, that's just ossification. There's no. While that can be tempting, because there are some moments in the past, like, you know, like ancient Greece, that are so good that you might just want to be ossified there forever. But, you know, the world changes. And rather than just being the sort of moaner, the old man should view himself to be a messenger of another time. And, you know, so the messenger can still rock to the latest tunes, but he remembers, you know, what was playing before.
But at the risk of being a moaner, I moan to myself almost on a daily basis that I have to create all of these base adapters for so all my new models that I'm making, I still put them on 20mm bases, right?
Yeah, me too.
Because they can go fuck themselves.
Yeah.
And I'm having to deal with, like, my Lord on Shield Bearers is on 40x40, so I've got an adapter to put him on 50x50, and then my other adapters, I've got to fit the big base into the unit with the small, and I'm just going crazy, being like, you bastards, why did you change the bases?
Anyway. I agree entirely, but yeah, I mean, this has also annoyed me as well. I mean, Bretonians, in a sense, it almost doesn't, because I don't really have any models in my Bretonian army, and I put my knights on their movement train. They don't really do any fighting, so they just stay, and my Pegasi just fly around. And yeah, the bases are a bit bigger, and I have some little adapters to put on them if I feel I have to, which makes them look crap. So I just leave them off most of the time, unless my opponent complains, and then I put them on, which is great. Like my wonderful adapter trays that have just got like a little bit of extra ground on the back, and I just slot it onto my Pegasi to make his base just a bit longer.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, but like that's going to make any difference. It's not, his frontage is the same. He just grows this long tail. Why did they do that? I mean, what?
Some of them, and I'll be the first person to admit, a lot of the models look good on the bigger bases. I'm not sort of.
No, I'm not. Some might. Others less so. I mean, it's you know, the annoying thing is that you don't want to have to rebase your models because you want compatibility between old editions. And I mean, it annoys me when I see an old world army on the new bases, because I think you can't play 8th or you can't play 6th.
No one cares.
Missing, man. You want to be able to go everywhere. Look, come on, holiday in Britain, but you know, go to Costa del Sol. You know, we want to be able to have everything rather than just, you know, railroading yourself. Railroading is an 8th edition term, by the way, for those of us stayed us that long. A gamey 8th term doesn't exist in Old World, but other
no one's listening to
railroading yourself into just only one edition.
yeah. No one's still listening now. Look, we've been going on for like
no one's listening, you know. So, which is why, dear listeners, at our 8th edition events, you will be allowed to turn up with Old World bases if you want to, because we don't want to push you off.
Yeah, that's a good point. So look out for news to come about the next 8th edition event in London.
Yeah, exactly. The London Legends. And we've done 2 8th ed events now. And, you know, I've also run an old event as well. So, I mean, it's not as though I've only done that. And, you know, there are still a few 8th edition events around. And there is, I think, a certain 8th ed scene that still exists. And I think it's important that continues to be played. And I mean, it's only a very minority pastime. But I think there should be 8th edition events and 6th edition events and, you know, other sorts of things as well. I think I love the diversity of this conversation between all the different editions, by the way. I really like that. I like that people have the different views in it and how it connects to a bunch of their philosophy about the hobby and when they played and their influences and stuff. I think that's great. I love that. It's like an intergenerational aspect to, like, a family of different generations. I love that. I think that should continue rather than everyone just all being the same.
Sure. Yeah. And I've got my Demons army, for example, which I have no intention of using now in Old World. I mean, it's a legacy army that they've totally changed the feel of it.
And it's all impetuous.
It's all exactly. That changes the I don't mind my orcs and goblins being all impetuous, because that's how I want to play orcs and goblins. But making my demons all impetuous just means the whole play style of the game, the army changes. And I don't want to start rebasing bloodletters. And I'm just going to leave it for 8.
Impetuous is, I mean, I know we're far into the twilight zone here, Diviers, but I mean, impetuous, again, that's another annoying rule from Old World. So impetuous used to be in 8th ed, a rule only knight errant had. And it meant leadership tester, you have to charge. And the good thing with that was you could keep your general and your BSB near and do some other things to stop your errant charging. Now, impetuous, you just 1 to 3, you charge. That's it. And I mean, there's nothing you can do. No general, no BSB. So what has happened to impetuous troops? They're unusable. There are no impetuous troops in competitive Old World at all. And poor old Simon's whole army is impetuous. Whole army as well. Yeah, I was complaining about impetuous, but oh my word, that's very easy. You don't want your goblin wolf boys to be impetuous.
Yeah, because you just can't use them. They give them bows, for example. What is the point of? They can have things like fire and flee and reserve move and evasive and all this stuff. But what's the point if they got to charge 50% of the time? What's the point?
Also, I thought goblins were cowardly. I thought goblins ran away.
Yeah.
Not now. They've become really brave, and they have to keep. They're arguing with each other about how. Oh, we've seen a greater demon. We just desperately want to charge him. Do you get immunity to psych on the charge with impetuous?
No, so you could fail impetuous and then fail your fear test and not charge. Yeah.
I love that. It's almost as perverse as the Schrodinger's charge, where you have to put them in marching column so they can't charge, and they have to take a test that they have to charge. So then you get an immovable object in irresistible force. Yeah. And what's the conclusion? Nothing happens. The unit just stays there because it's simultaneously overcome by 2 force measures, and the goblins just stay there statically. That is bad, rules writing, man. That's so stupid.
For the nomadic war, though, I actually don't mind impetuous because that's the play style that I want to move forward and charge things. It's fine, and I've got so many units that if one charges off, it's not the worst.
Yeah, but you also have that item, don't you, called the thinking hat.
The thinking hat, yeah.
The thinking hat. I wonder who put that there. They thought, maybe we should have this item that turns off the major nerf. Yeah. I think that all armies, I think Khorne demons should be allowed to have that as well.
Exactly, yeah.
The thinking hat should just become now a common magic item that everyone can have. And it's a 5-point upgrade for your champion. You can have a thinking hat, and then there's just no impetuous.
There's another janky thing you can do with orcs and goblins as well, right? It's because they all have the warband rule.
Yeah.
Which allows you to re-roll charges, but it doesn't say re-roll failed charges, right? So you could make your charge because you failed impetuous and then re-roll it to try and fail it.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That is absolutely a classic. Yeah. No, I do like that. It's a bit like wanting to deliberately fail leadership tests, or like trying to deliberately roll, or optional swift stride, right? I have to charge because of impetuous, and then I decide not to be swift stride.
Yeah.
So I don't get there. Which is really silly, because on one level you've got lads, let's go and get him. And then also another thought, and actually let's make our horses not go very quickly so we don't like what very peculiar.
Or you can, if you're drilled, right? Let's say you're like chosen Chaos Knights of Khorne, right? So you're friendly, you got to charge, but then you use drilled so that something gets in your way and you don't make the charge.
Can you use drilled to then go into a marching column so you can't charge?
Maybe, I don't.
That's probably even more funny.
Yeah.
Oh my word. Yeah, so there again, dear viewer, there was none of this in 8th edition. They didn't have these things that sort of contradicted themselves, which I just think appeared because they just didn't test the rules they were writing with anybody who was remotely competitive. And so thus these things appeared. And maybe they just thought, no one will do this. They'll just rub along. They're all nice chaps.
There are a few quirky things in 8th.
There are a few, but not that many.
No.
Not compared to, not things that actually contradict each other.
Yeah.
Like that. Like as I say, like we've given you some examples there. Those seem very funny to me. Almost just hilarious. But there you
Are
go.
you going to any other old world events? Anything booked?
I don't have anything on the calendar. I wish I had put my name down for the Square-based open online event.
Oh,
Because
really?
yeah, well, I tell you what I would have taken to that. I'd have taken a dwarf expeditionary force, and I'd have had 3 units of 4 gyrocopters, I think, 3 units of 2 scout gyrocopters, and 3 gyro bombers. And then I think all the rest of my points would be one line of rangers, and maybe one, if I could have afforded it, one organ gun and with Grim Burlexen or something. But the point of it really is that even with the rule of 3, you can put so many gyrocopters on the table there, man. I don't know who would be able to defeat that. That seems to me to be because they have the scout gyrocopter in the dwarf expeditionary force, which means it's not as good as the normal gyrocopter, but it's still a gyrocopter.
Yeah.
And if that's what you like, just gyrocopter is 360 degrees. It's got a gun that lets you march and shoot. It's got fire and flee. I mean, you're not doing an enormous amount of damage with it, but your opponent won't ever be able to charge you.
Yeah.
Ever. So
they could magic missile you, I suppose.
They could. That's probably true.
Yeah.
That's about the only thing I think it's vulnerable to. And I think that's about it. And even in that list, you've still got 35 rangers with crossbows. So it is exerting quite a bit of threat.
I've got no interest in playing the online tournament, to be honest.
Yeah, well, online is... Yeah, I've played a lot of online Ninth Age. It's a place where you go and you pick horrible lists that you wouldn't ordinarily use.
Well, that was but apparently there was, I don't know if it's the same tournament. Apparently there was some dude with like 100 skeletons with poison or something.
Yes, there's a Tomb King list with that. Exactly. It should be regarded as a twisted, like, kind of all-nighter horror car crash for those of them who like that. Probably best done, with a lot of drink and that kind of thing, if you really want that. But I don't think it has a lot of... It's not a virtuous way of playing Warhammer, in my opinion. As I don't really have that much time for it. And when people talk about the way it changes the meta, again, I don't know if I agree with that, because what you do online and what you do in real life are a bit different. You can play, you spend 6 hours playing online as well. So you measure everything.
Really?
Yes.
So there's no clock for how long to make your move?
I think in that, I'm not sure. I think in their tournament, there probably is a round time limit, but both players would have to agree to stick to it. But no, in theory, if you're playing, you can save and come back and stuff. I've sometimes played some games of Ninth Age, which were going on for 8 hours because they were so anally retentive, and because you measure every single thing all the time with perfect accuracy. And you do load. Also, you have a back button, so I can like go and plant this unit like on the screen and see if that goes there. How will this interact? And you can just do all of this theory hammer with it. Whereas with a clock and physical models, you've got to make a decision, and you can only be so precise. And these are some of the reasons why online play is completely different. You have to make quicker decisions, and online, no. Gone forever, and you can have whatever army you like. Very different.
Yeah, no commitment to the actual models. Yeah,
that's true too. Yeah, no commitment at all. I mean, I would never. I mean, how many gyrocopters was in that list I just said? 20 and 3 bombers.
Yeah.
Who would make? Even the biggest fan of the gyrocopter wouldn't do this.
I think I've seen a couple of lists like that. I think somebody made the gyrocopter list.
Oh, really?
I think on the dwarf group, I've seen pictures of it.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Maybe it does exist after all. I have seen someone with about 6. I've seen someone with 6 gyrocopters in 8th, but that's the most I've seen. But you see, that gyrocopter list that I mentioned, that's a way round. One comp thing there has always been is a rule of 3. Almost from the beginning of Old World, people have said, oh, you can only have 3 of a certain thing, or 6 if it's core. And obviously that means only 3 gyrocopter choices from special.
Yeah.
And that, I think, particularly gyrocopters, was a reason that was introduced from the beginning. But of course, if you have the scout gyrocopter, then suddenly you've got double the number of gyrocopters in special. And so then suddenly you can start to do different things with your army, and you can get around that community imposed rule of 3. But that's slightly, again, pushing against what people are supposed to doing. And I've been saying, you know, trying to disapprove of MetaHammer and all the rest of it. But with online play, I don't care what you do. There's off limits there as far as I'm aware. It's like, you know, the parents are gone, you know, you can raid the cookie jar, you can like whatever you like on online. But not at my tournament. I've got my gate.
Exactly.
Only the worthy can go through it. It requires a very, very precise set of philosophical commitments, or otherwise I'm going to shut it in your face.
You shall not pass.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. You shall not pass. The gatekeeping.
Good.
All right. Okay, punks. I think we've reached a conclusion.
Yeah. Oh, we're still recording.
We are still recording, and I don't know what to do with this, but I'll do an end anyway. Well, you know, thank you for roughly on correctly. Thank you for getting that far, everybody, and thank you very much to D6 Wounds Simon for coming on to the channel. And yes, you should enjoy his own content, you know, as we both venture boldly into, well, not where no one has gone before, or no man has gone before, depending on your preferred version of that. Because you know, we have been in the old world. I played like 110 games of it by now, so I feel as though I am not in unknown outer space. In fact, I feel as though it is all a bit too familiar, and I need something to spice things up.
Yeah, well, let's hope the game gets spiced up, and you know, the meta changes. We introduce more missions and comp, and the whole thing just gets more exciting, and there's more variety, and it's, you know, more enjoyable.
It becomes more exciting, and it becomes as good as it can be. And that is, you know, all you can wish of anything. Not becomes something that it's not, just becomes as good as it can be.